let's talk about when the government can prosecute citizens in the United States for their speech on the grounds that their speech was incitement. So for a while during World War I, the government was very protective of the war effort. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against free speech in many of those cases. There were cases like Schenck v. United States. There were cases like California versus Whitney. All of them took a more restrictive approach to free speech. They upheld this standard called the clear and present danger standard, which was not very friendly to speech. The idea that the government could come in and penalize speech that presents a clear and present danger. But it got overruled in the case of Brandenburg v. Ohio, a 1969 Supreme Court case. It was per curiam, so no Supreme Court justice signed their name to it individually. There are two concurrences, and basically it's coming along and creating this new standard for us for how we assess speech that could be seen as incitement. So in the 1960s, a man named Clarence Brandenburg was basically on film dressed in Klan uniform, and he was giving a really vitriolic, angry speech. He said that if the President of the United States, members of Congress, the Supreme Court, and all of them continue to suppress the white race, there might need to be some revengeance taken. And revengeance is not a word, but you get the gist of what he's saying. We need to get revenge. We might need to get revenge if these people keep going after us white folk. He said, quote, "We are marching on Congress July 4th, 400,000 strong. From there, we are dividing into two groups. One group to march on St. Augustine, Florida. The other group to march into Mississippi. Thank you." And the prosecution presented a bunch of other pieces of film of him that made him look really bad. That kind of sound like he was plotting something bad, but not anything super specific. And this is where the prosecution of Clarence Brandenburg is going to become problematic when it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court. So he was being prosecuted under Ohio's criminal syndicalism statute, and that ends up getting ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court unanimously. So the Supreme Court held free speech and free press don't allow a state to prohibit advocacy of use of force or of law violation except where the advocacy is first directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to produce or incite such action. So we got to pay attention to the imminence. If it's likely to produce action, lawless action, 7 days from now, is that really imminent? We have to assess the likeliness. What type of crowd is this person speaking to? Is this person speaking to a crowd that has a proclivity toward violence, an angry crowd, a crowd that might not like what they're saying? If you're yelling about how you can't stand a certain person and a certain person is like terrible and evil, is the crowd that you're talking to, the group of people, likely to act on that, likely to resort to violence or lawless action against that person? That's just an example. And then, incite, you have to really be going after the idea that, hey, I want you to do this. I want you to do this. And there needs to be some specificity, a time frame. Not just like some indefinite threat, like, someday I'm gonna beat the hell out of you. That's not a threat. Or we should all beat the hell out of him at some point. There's not enough specificity there. So the U.S. Supreme Court, and he made racist remarks too, but those are not necessarily indicative of incitement. So the U.S. Supreme Court announces this new standard, the imminent lawless action standard. It's still the law of the land today for First Amendment incitement purposes. Justice William O. Douglas, a very progressive Supreme Court justice, served the longest out of any Supreme Court justice we've ever had so far. Basically wrote, there's no place in the First Amendment for clear and present danger standard. So his concurrence is agreeing with getting rid of the clear and present danger standard that they had for quite a few decades. He said, regardless of how strict it is, clear and present danger is wrong. So he's going to go on to take a more pro-free speech stance than the U.S. Supreme Court's majority here, the per curiam majority. He says, very rarely can we justify prosecution of someone for speech. It's very, very hard. There needs to really be some action in there. Brigaded by action is the term that he uses. So yeah, he and Justice Hugo Black, who was an FDR appointee, served for a long time. Black wrote a concurrence, basically really short, agreeing with William O. Douglas, and kind of emphasizing his old view that no law means no law. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. That means no law, no matter how well-intentioned it is, no matter how loosely it's going after speech or how strictly it's going after speech, no matter how egregious the speech is it's going after. So these two guys are warriors for free speech. They are borderline free speech absolutists. Yeah, it was an interesting time period, the 1960s. But yeah, this is still the law on incitement. So when someone says someone incited something, they might be talking legally, or they might be talking, just intuitively. But legally, the court is going to look at these things through the lens of Brandenburg, the Brandenburg test. People say, oh, Trump incited a riot on January 6th. So, you might ask them, do you mean legally, or do you mean he caused it to happen? It's an interesting question when someone uses the word incitement. Yeah, Clarence Brandenburg is obviously not a sympathetic guy at all. The U.S. Supreme Court probably did not like his racist views. Nonetheless, they sided with his First Amendment rights. They felt it was time for the doctrine to evolve, and it has evolved. They were very protective in a century ago in the 1910s and 1920s over this whole draft effort thing, the war effort, the draft. People who purport to support socialism, they were very concerned about that. Communism, the Red Scare, they thought that stuff like that was kind of just inherently toxic and violent. And, there were dissents. Those cases weren't unanimous. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, a brilliant figure, he famously dissented, and now he seems to have won the day. But yeah, I think U.S. Supreme Court precedent on First Amendment is just so fascinating. It's really fun to look into, so take some time and look at our First Amendment doctrine, because there's so much debate over it in the political world too. People say, oh, this candidate is against the First Amendment because they said this. And it's like, okay, how can we really substantiate that? Well, we gotta look at the case law, because the U.S. Supreme Court as a judicial branch interprets the U.S. Constitution. Basically, whatever they say about the U.S. Constitution is what the U.S. Constitution says. And obviously they change their minds plenty, which is in the form of their overruling of cases, i.e. Dobbs overruling Roe versus Wade. So yeah, let me know what you think about incitement, about the First Amendment, about Brandenburg versus Ohio in the comments below. Do you think that we need an even looser standard? We need to allow even more speech? Let me know. As always, please like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. I hope that if you're a law student in First Amendment classes, or you're an undergrad or a high school student who is learning First Amendment doctrine and probably has to look at this case or something, I hope that this was helpful for you. I'm here for you when it comes to all aspects of the law. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. This has been the Morris, the Merrier, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video.